So is a recession looming, and what problems could that create politically for the federal government? The Scrum is here to answer that. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief of the Globe and Mail. Stephanie Levitz is a parliamentary reporter with the Toronto Star. And our special guest is Parliamentary Budget Officer Yves Giroux. Welcome, everybody, and Happy New Year to you all. Mr. Giroux, I want to start with you. High interest rates, high inflation. It's more expensive for Canadians to go to the grocery store, to fill up their cars. But they're also paying, in some cases, hundreds of dollars more per month on their mortgages, people who have floating rates. Is this all heading towards a recession this year? And if so, how deep will it be? How long will it last?
Well, it's possible that 2023 will be a recession year, but I don't think it's unavoidable. It's not like written in stone. In good part because we have a relatively strong employment market, so the job market is still very strong. And in our scenario, we don't anticipate a recession. There'll be a marked slowdown, but a recession, maybe not, unless the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve over-tighten, so go above what is strictly necessary
which could happen.
tame inflation.
We don't have a crystal ball on that.
It's quite possible for reasons of credibility. Central banks around the world may want to reinstate their credibility by over-tightening to ensure that inflation is nipped in the bud and that inflation expectations remain anchored within the target range of 1 to 3% in Canada. But by all means, I don't think a recession is a foregone conclusion or unavoidable.
Steph, the federal government still has a lot of big spending ahead of them, climate change, infrastructure, the healthcare transfers to the provinces. That's something that's still being negotiated, but that's going to be, again, a big ticket item. And then there's pharmacare, which they promised as part of their deal with the NDP. Is this all doable still, or does the situation with the interest rates and inflation just kind of throw a monkey wrench into all that?
Well, I mean, you have to imagine perhaps the federal government sitting down and now beginning to put things in buckets. What are the things we must do? What are the things we could do or should do? And what are the things that can wait? And in the can wait file, that's the hardest file, right? Because there's a lot of competing political pressures on that. There's definitely a political pressure that says you cannot wait any longer to deal with climate change. That money must be out the door now. That adaptation must be there. We know that infrastructure spending, for example, in a recessionary environment, infrastructure spending is one of those things that is used as a tool of economic growth. So maybe you want to start pushing that out. On healthcare, I mean, that's an interesting one because I think all Canadians, no matter their income level, are looking at the healthcare system and thinking, this is not working. Right. But the question becomes, is throwing money out the door the answer to the problem? Right. And can the federal government and its provincial partners thread the needle there, right? And say, okay, we will put some more money at it, but we need to fix things first. And that's probably the trickiest one to manage.
Yeah. Bob, the federal government has a lot of runway here as long as their deal with the NDP holds up. How important is it that they get these economic problems behind them before we start talking about another election?
Well, first of all, this is a government that has shown no inclination of any to have physical discipline. They just shovel money out the door. Whoever wants the money, no problem, will give it to you. And so I'm not optimistic that they are going to stop the stimulating the economy, which the Bank of Canada and other economists say, you know, you really got to pull back on this spending. Right. So I don't think they're going to do that, and that's probably going to make inflation worse. Whether we go into recession, I suppose it just depends on how the U.S. economy goes. Right. But in terms of the NDP deal, as long as they can keep this deal in place, I think they're going to keep it in place. And if they have to pay off the NDP, they will. Right. As you can see in that by-election in Toronto, the NDP numbers were way down, and the Liberals benefited from them. So the Liberals are the ones who are benefiting from this deal, not the NDP.
Yeah, Mr. Giroux, well, let's talk about that government spending, because in the last fiscal update, they proposed more billions of dollars in more spending above and beyond just pandemic relief. We also know the cost of servicing the debt are going up because the interest rates are going up. To what extent is government spending, its fiscal policy, contributing to inflation? Because Pierre Poilievre likes to say this is just inflation. He's the cause of it because of all the spending. How much of that increase do you apportion to the federal government?
Well, to use a movie analogy, I think inflation is probably in good part a global phenomenon, but domestic factors such as government spending are playing a key supporting role in supporting inflation. So it's not the determining factor, but it is certainly contributing to inflation, especially if we compare the level of government spending prior to the pandemic compared to what we are seeing right now. So it's clearly supporting inflation. It's not the main factor behind it, but it's a driving force.
Yeah. Steph, housing remains a huge problem, both affordable housing and housing just for regular folks who are finding young people completely shut out of the market now, essentially. Rising interest rates don't help. Is anything the federal government doing going to make any kind of tangible difference to that problem?
It's interesting, you know, just before the holidays, there was a decision taken by the financial institution that sets mortgage rates, and they decided to leave the stress test as it was, which means that they're applying, you know, what does it take to get you a mortgage? And they left that approach at the exact same approach, I guess, for when interest rates were at rock bottom. And so you think, what? I mean, you think that interest rates are rising, houses are becoming less affordable. Why would you keep trying to drive people into the market? And that was an interesting question or an interesting move by the federal government. And we asked, you know, the housing minister, well, what do you make of that? And his only answer is we need to build more houses. And that's a bit of a spurious answer, right, Glenn? I mean, for one, the federal government's not quite in the housing construction business.
Not yet, no.
Not yet. And, you know, is that what it takes, right? Is it literally takes some public servants, you know, to start digging and build houses? I'm not sure.
Bob, you were obviously around covering the Chrétien-Martin government, and at a time when deficits were very politically toxic, and voters really seemed to respond to it back then. Now we've got a massive national debt that this government has added to, in large part because of all the pandemic relief measures, though. Do voters care about deficits anymore?
They probably don't, but you have to look at the reasons why people were accepting of the Martin Chrétien massive cuts, because we had inflation starting in the 70s. And we were going through some very, very, very serious recessions, and still we were not licking inflation. And so when they came in, and we were hitting a financial wall, frankly, in the world.
We were worried we were going to become like Argentina with the currency crisis.
And so, you know, all credit to Mr. Chrétien and Paul Martin, because they really bit the bullet, and they cut and cut deeply. And as a result of that, until the Trudeau government came in, we didn't have we never had deficits to really.
Well, so Stephen Harper ran deficits.
He ran a deficit, but he got rid of that during the 29 financial crisis. But we didn't have deficits. We pretty much came surplus. So
excellent. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Yves Giroux, for coming in.
My pleasure.